Author webinars are a powerful tool for connecting with your readers and growing your email list. I will say that around half of my new email subscribers join my email list through a webinar. And after spending an hour hearing my voice, seeing my face, and interacting with me live, they know who I am. They open my emails and they stay subscribed for a long time. So in many ways, it's the best way to get someone on an email list because they start with a really strong connection. Webinars are also a great way for listening to your audience. A typical novel marketing podcast episode will bring in 1 to 5 comments per episode. But my typical webinar brings in 1 to 5 comments per minute. That's over 100 comments on a 60-minute webinar. Between the comments, the questions, and the polls, hosting a webinar gives me a great opportunity to get to know my audience better, which helps me serve them better, which helps me hopefully make these podcast episodes a little bit better. Webinars are also great for calling people to action, whether that's donating to a nonprofit, buying your book, signing up for your course, or backing your Kickstarter campaign. Most of my course sales come from people who first attended a live webinar. So, hosting a webinar can be a powerful tactic, but it requires proper preparation. Otherwise, you're giving a talk to an empty room and it's an expensive waste of time. So, how do you prepare the kind of webinar that readers will want to attend? Find out in this episode of Novel Marketing, the longest running book marketing podcast in the world. I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr., CEO of Author Media, and this is the show for writers who want to build their platform, sell more books, and make a living writing books worth talking about. This is the second episode in my ongoing series about author webinars. The first is how to look and sound professional on Zoom, webinars, and podcasts. In that episode, I talk specifically about how to look good on camera and talk about the technical aspects of the microphone and camera, which I will not be going into in this episode. I will have a link, though, in the show notes to that other episode that you can find at authormedia.com/363. There will be other episodes in the webinars series in the future, so make sure you're subscribed on your podcast app. Now, before we get started, I should point out that webinars tend to work best for nonfiction authors. Now, some novelists are able to make webinars work, and I'll have tips for novelists as we go, but just realize that novelists often prefer live streams, which are a bit cheaper. So let's talk about the difference between a webinar and a live stream. Live streams are live videos that tend to run through free platforms like Facebook or YouTube. They are often open to the public and don't require registration to attend. Live events are low attendance events where attendees come and go throughout the event. So at any given time, there's not very many people there. A well-executed live stream can grow viewers over time if the algorithms pick it up, but that is very rare, particularly for novelists. It's not uncommon for novelists to host a live stream launch party, although I recommend against it. Most live streams, especially on Facebook, get very few viewers. I host a live stream for a nonprofit once a year. This nonprofit has over 150,000 followers on Facebook, and the most we've been able to get on a live stream recently is around 100 people at any given time. This is fewer attendees than I can personally get on a webinar with a much smaller total audience than this nonprofit has. And I'm the person presenting both times. So why do so few people watch Facebook live streams these days? Well, ever since the Christchurch shooting was live streamed on Facebook, Facebook has de-emphasized the live streams in the algorithm. And so now, even though people are live streaming all the time, you can scroll on Facebook all day long and never see a live stream. So it's actually really hard to find a live stream, and it's really hard to get people to your live stream if you're live streaming on Facebook. Also remember, Facebook shares data with Amazon. And Amazon will sometimes delete reviews from readers who all gathered together on a Facebook live stream. So hosting your book launch party on a Facebook live stream can be poisonous for your initial reviews for your book. You really want to avoid Facebook as much as possible. The more you spend time on Facebook, the more reviews will get deleted. Facebook has become really toxic if you want to get reviews. That said, I know some of you are going to ignore me and you want to do a Facebook Live anyway. And if you do want to do a Facebook Live, I still have my episode about how to host Facebook Live events live from a long time ago, before Facebook started sharing data with Amazon and before they diminished Facebook live streams in the feed. But you can still go back and listen to that episode, and I'll have a link to it in the show notes. So webinars, on the other hand, require attendees to sign up with their email address, and they take place on a separate website or app. This is why they're good for email list growth, because attendees have to give you their email address in order to attend. Webinars are typically not streamed to YouTube or Facebook, despite this being both possible and easy on most webinar platforms. Because the whole point is the registration. That small amount of friction turns the webinar into an appointment event with high attendance at first, and it tends to go downward over time as people leave. But if you do a good job delivering the webinar, it will go down slowly. Unlike live streams, people don't tend to come and go from a webinar. So you have high attendance at first, and the longer it goes, the lower the attendance will be. So while live streams are always free to attend, webinars can be paid or free. A virtual summit is often just a collection of webinars, one right after another. One author I follow hosted a webinar a couple of weeks ago that was $750 per person to attend. And no, that was not overpriced for his topic and his audience. He writes about geopolitics, and if you want to know how the war in Ukraine will impact your factory or your multinational company, he's the go-to guy for the answer. And that kind of reader is not very price sensitive. Live streams, on the other hand, tend to be background events that people are listening to while they're doing something else, while a webinar, if it's done well, is a foreground event that people are watching and giving their full attention. Live streams come with the illusion that Facebook or YouTube will help bring you viewers, but with a webinar, there is no illusion. You know that the only way to get people to your webinar is to do it yourself. Which leads us to how to get people to come to your webinar. So the first challenge you need to overcome is getting people to want to come to your webinar. Your webinar needs to be so appealing, they not only want to sign up for it, but also add it to their calendar and then show up live, even with all the other things they have going on that day. That requires more than an announcement. So let's talk about how to get people to sign up for your webinar. And I have 4 steps for you. And if you've been around novel marketing for any amount of time, you know what the first step is. And that is to pick a Timothy. The more specific your target audience, the easier the following steps will be. So pick a target attendee, an actual human being to represent everyone you want to attend. This is a practice I call picking a Timothy. So once you've picked your real human, you ask him or her some questions. What does he want? What pain is he in? And how can you start to alleviate that pain in a webinar? The authors who struggle to get people into their webinars tend to skip this step. Instead, they target generic women between 20 and 55 who like to read my genre. And the problem with that kind of generic target, or an avatar or a persona that's a composite, is that that fictional person can't answer questions and doesn't end up helping you make good decisions. Step 2 is to write a pain-killing title. The title of the webinar needs to make a very clear promise. The better that promise is connected to the pain they feel, the more signups you will get. You can present your webinar as a vitamin or as a painkiller. And for the sake of your email list growth, I hope you present it as a painkiller. So let's say you write books on helping people with their finances. You could create a webinar with the title like How to Create a Budget. Everybody knows they need a budget, just like everyone knows they need to take their vitamins. But most people forget to take their vitamins. They don't get around to it. They say they'll do it, But then when time comes, they do something else. Have you remembered to take your vitamins today? So to make the title better, let's go back to step 1. Who is your target attendee? What pain is he in? So let's say Timothy is drowning in debt and considering bankruptcy, while a budget may be just the thing he needs to regain control over his finances. But he may not know that or believe it. So selling him a budget isn't what to do. So instead, create a pain-killing version of that same talk, right? So you could say something like how to create a debt-shrinking budget, or even how to avoid bankruptcy. So he comes wanting to learn how to avoid bankruptcy, and what is the answer to avoiding bankruptcy? Creating and following a budget, right? But you don't lead with the budget, you lead with the pain. This seems like a minor change, but it makes all the difference. Now, if you write fiction, you want to make the title as entertaining as possible. This time that they spend with you on this webinar needs to feel exciting, thrilling, or hilarious. Your fiction webinar could be about reacting to something in popular media. So, for example, I once helped Kathy Tyers host a webinar where we speculated about the plot of the next Star Wars film. So Kathy has written a bunch of famous Star Wars books in the extended universe. Back when I was a kid, we didn't have the sequel movies. We had the sequel books, and they told their own version of the story. And so we were speculating what was going to be in the sequel series. Now, she had no knowledge of this, right? She was not on the inside. Disney didn't ask her for help. I think to their detriment, quite frankly. They definitely didn't tune in to our webinar because the things we were anticipating were not the things that happened. But we had a lot of fun, and the audience had a lot of fun guessing what was going to be in the next Disney Star Wars film. And we brought in a whole bunch of new subscribers for Kathy Tyers' email list. And you could do something similar. Obviously, Kathy Tyers had an advantage in that she had written some Star Wars books. But if you write epic fantasy and there's a new epic fantasy TV show or movie, you could do a webinar where you're reacting to it and you're getting audience feedback, right? It's a spoiler reaction. So you can talk about what you liked and what you didn't like, and you can have theories as to what's going to happen next time. This is just an idea. There's a bunch of different ways that you can play this, but you do have to be a little bit more creative to get fiction readers to want to come to a webinar. For nonfiction, it's pretty straightforward. You just identify the pain and promise to help alleviate the pain. Step 3 to getting people to want to come to your webinar is to write a compelling description. Most webinar landing pages have 3 elements: a title, which we've already talked about, an image, and you want to have a good image, and a description. The description is a paragraph or 2 that goes into more detail about the webinar. This is not where you describe what they will learn. This is where you promise the transformation they will experience. Think of this as a menu item at a restaurant, right? You don't talk about the recipe, you talk about how great it will taste. You only mention the ingredients if it helps the goal of making the dish sound delicious. So don't give too much detail here. Just focus on the highlights, the high points. Okay, so now we've identified the pain. We've written a pain-killing title, and we have a great description and a photo. The landing page for our webinar is now ready to go. Now what? Well, that brings us to step 4. Spread the word. We want to put this landing page in front of the most people and the most likely people to attend as possible. So the first place you want to promote is your own email list. When I host a webinar for my email subscribers, I typically get 500 to 800 people who register based off of my email list. And interestingly, I'll add sometimes as many as 100 new email addresses to my list. And this happens even if I only promote the webinar to people who are already subscribed to my email list. So why? Why the email list growth? Well, I got a clue once when somebody accidentally forwarded me the email that they meant to forward to their colleague, telling their colleague to come to my webinar. And I've had literary agents make my webinars required viewing for their clients. And so if you build a reputation of having helpful webinars, the kind of webinars that people enjoy coming to, people will recommend your webinars to their friends. And that email inviting them to the webinar is very easy to share. So you can get really solid growth from your existing fans. People very rarely email a podcast episode, but a webinar has that sense of urgency, right? You've got to sign up before the webinar starts or you can't attend live, which makes the email about the webinar far more viral and far more effective at growing my email list. People do share the blog version of my podcast episodes. So it's not like nobody shares the blog version, but there's something special about the urgency of a webinar that's really quite special. Another way to spread the word is to find a partner. And this is the second way that I personally do it. So I'll partner with somebody else who has an audience who would be interested in what I have to say. And if I'm selling something in the webinar, I'll typically share the proceeds of what we're selling with that other person through my affiliate program. And I have a whole episode on affiliate marketing if you want to learn more about this approach. For selling courses, I really think webinars are the way to do it because somebody needs to hear you and see you and experience your teaching before they want to pay for more of your teaching. So you can't do that on a landing page alone. You can also trade webinars with a similar author, right? They host a webinar for you to talk about your book to their audience, and you host a webinar with them to talk about their book with your audience, or you could host a webinar together for both of your audiences. I think for fiction, this probably works better. You're both writing military sci-fi, so you have a military sci-fi webinar where you're talking about military science fiction, and it's the two authors together. I can see it being a real draw. Typically with partner webinars, we'll both answer questions at the end, and that's its own draw, right? Where people get to ask me questions, and they also get to ask questions of whoever it is that they already respect because they're already on that person's email list. What you want to look for in a partner is somebody with a strong email list. Because email is what gets people to webinars. It was interesting because I gave a webinar last week about the book launch blueprint, and we're talking about how you use email for book launches. And one of the ladies in the chat was like, I hate email. And I didn't see that chat comment at the time, but if I had, I would have been like, but email's what got you to this webinar. You're only here because email worked. And so it doesn't matter whether you like it or not. It only matters if it works. And obviously it works because I didn't promote that webinar any other way other than email. And so if you're not getting the Author Media emails, you wouldn't have known about it. I will have a link to the replay, though, in the show notes of this episode. Another way to promote your webinar is to advertise. If you follow any webinar gurus, and there's a bunch of webinar gurus out there who will sell you a course on how to do webinars, and they'll often talk about advertising as a way to get webinar attendees. For mid to large ticket purchases, this can be a great way to get folks to sign up for your, course, because they're not going to sign up for a course off of an ad. But if the ad is promoting a free webinar, then they spend an hour with you in the webinar and you blow their socks off with your expertise and your helpfulness. Then when you say, hey, if this was helpful, I can teach you even more. If you buy my program, then they may go on to buy, and you take a potential customer through the attract, engage, and convert process in a short period of time. Now, the problem with advertising is that for authors, it's just too expensive to work for most books. So let's say that it costs $1 per person to get strangers to sign up for your webinar, right? So you have to spend $1 worth of ads per sign up. And now let's say that 3% of them go on to buy. So you've got a 3% conversion rate on your webinar. That means you're spending $30 to $35 per person to sell a copy of your book. Now, those numbers don't work for a $20 book, right? If you're spending $35 to sell a $20 book, you're losing money. But they do work for a $1,000 course. If your course is $1,000, you're happy to pay $35 to acquire a student. So you have to be careful who you're getting advice from when it comes to webinars. I don't feel like paying for ads to sell a book through a webinar works particularly well. A $35 cost of reader acquisition could work for certain kinds of really addictive viral fiction. If you've got a long series of books and people read through the whole thing, you may make more than $35 per reader. But I don't think sending somebody through a webinar as a part of that process is the better way to do it. I think it'd be better to just bring them straight to a page on Amazon where they can just buy the book. Because if somebody's going to spend $1,000 on the course, they need an hour-long webinar to decide whether or not they want the course. But if somebody's spending $20 on a book, they don't necessarily need an hour-long webinar to decide if they want to buy your book. It's a great tool if you have a cost-effective way of getting people to sign up, but I don't think advertising is necessarily the answer here. If you have a podcast, though, you can try dynamic content insertion, which is a new technology that Buzzsprout rolled out last year that allows you to dynamically insert audio at the beginning and end of all your old podcast episodes. And I experimented with this last year. I dropped in a spot for a webinar coming up in 3 weeks saying, hey, I'm doing a webinar. Go to this URL to sign up. And at the end of the 3 weeks, I was able to go in and just with a couple of clicks, take that promotional material off of all those old episodes. So someone listening to that show today wouldn't hear an ad for a webinar that happened in the past. And this was pretty effective and very effective way of converting podcast listeners to email list subscribers because it got them through the webinar onto my email list. So you may be wondering, Thomas, why haven't you tried that with Novel Marketing? Well, I don't host Novel Marketing with Buzzsprout. I host Novel Marketing with Blueberry, and Blueberry didn't offer dynamic content insertion, or at least it didn't until last week. So I just added this. So you may be hearing dynamic content soon. I'm going to start playing with it, and I want to hear what you think. If you like it or if you don't like it, either way, let me know, because I don't want to irritate you, but I do want to serve you well, and I need to hear from you to know which I'm doing. Okay, so now that we have people signing up for the webinar, let's talk about how to prepare a killer presentation. So the challenge with presenting to a webinar is that the internet is just a tab away. And if you're not careful, you'll have your audience's ears, but not their eyes. And when this happens, you go from foreground listening to background noise. And at that point, it might as well be a live stream. Attendees are not going to buy your book if you're background noise. So you need to make your webinar visually interesting. So how do I do this? I don't rely on my face being visually interesting. I don't think my face is particularly interesting. So I use slides, lots and lots of slides. So I checked the slide count on my two most popular webinars, and one has 142 slides and the other one has 91 slides. And these talks are both about 40 minutes long. So that's a new slide every 20 to 30 seconds. If that seems fast, realize that TV shows cut to a new camera angle every 3 to 7 seconds. So it doesn't feel fast for someone watching the webinar. But my goal is for it to be interesting enough where they never want to leave and go to some other tab. And so from that perspective, 20 to 30 seconds is actually kind of slow, but it's way faster than most presentations. So I want you to imagine that you have a slide up for a whole minute, right? People are going to get bored looking at the same static PowerPoint slide for a whole minute, and they're going to click away, and now you've lost them. And I have what I feel like is decent audience retention on my webinars, and I feel like a big part of that has to do with slide frequency. So I have one simple trick for you to dramatically increase your slides without adding content or even a whole lot of work for you. And this is the tip. One idea per slide. So imagine you've got a PowerPoint slide with 3 bullet points, and you normally talk on that slide for 60 seconds. Just take each of those bullet points and make it its own slide, just for that one bullet point. Now you have 3 slides, and you're changing slides every 20 seconds. But what's more, now that you have one idea per slide, finding a good image to explain that one idea gets way easier. It does mean you're going to need to spend some more money on stock photos, though, but I've found that good stock photos are well worth the investment because you only have to buy the stock photos once, and every time you give that talk, the cheaper they are on a per talk basis. Speaking of stock photos, I get almost all of my stock photos these days from Deposit Photos. I'll have an affiliate link to them. And I also use the Noun Project. The Noun Project creates kind of icons for every noun in the English language. I would rather pay money to find a good stock photo quickly than spend hours trying to find a free stock photo. When I was younger, I would hunt and hunt and hunt for good legal free stock photos. One of our most popular blog posts of all time is where to find free and legal stock photos. But as I get older, I start to value my time more, and spending $1 to buy a good stock photo on Deposit Photos is well worth the money. That said, if you want free stock photos, Unsplash is the website with the best free stock photos. Just avoid the top and bottom lines. Those are paid. So they try to trick you into sneaking away to a very similar website that will sell you very similar stock photos. For more on designing incredible looking slides, there's 2 books that I recommend. The first is Beyond Bullet Points by Cliff Atkinson, and the second is Presentation Zen by Gar Reynolds. And I'll have affiliate links to both of those books in the show notes. These books have given my talks a competitive advantage for years. When I was in my 20s, I was able to travel the world teaching authors who were twice my age, despite the fact that I had never personally written a book. Why? Because I had read those 2 books on good slides and the other conference speakers had not. So it really gave me an advantage. And you can buy those books for $20 each, and you can have that advantage yourself. It's not that big of a secret. And the books are not new. They've been out for over 10 years each. Another tip on slides is, as you're developing your talk, use metaphors to give you ideas for your slides. It helps make your communication more concrete and more approachable. So lean on your metaphors. If you have a bullet that talks about how life without a budget is like digging a hole where the dirt is landing on your head, show a photo of a man digging a hole while you make that point. It will make that point more emotionally resonant. And if you can't find or can't think of a good image, it may be a symptom that what you're talking about is too abstract and too vague. And the act of finding an image to help you communicate that point actually makes the talk itself better. Another element of making slides for webinars is that people are watching them in a different way. So when you're designing a slide for an in-person event, you have to keep the slide simple so that people in the back of the room can still understand the slide. While with a webinar, everybody has the slide right in front of them. So you can get away with a higher level of complexity. Now, normally showing a chart or a graph is a big no-no for slides. Presentation Zen warns against it, and Beyond Bullet Points has really clear guidelines on how not to do it wrong, because almost everyone does it wrong almost all the time. And in general, I have a rule where I only allow myself 1 chart per talk max, and I try to have most of my talks not have any charts. But with a webinar, you might be able to get away with it. I still don't recommend going crazy with the charts. Remember, the most important job of every slide is to be interesting. So the chart has to be interesting. But since people are closer to the screen, you can get away with a slightly higher level of data density. I still shy away from charts and graphs in my presentations, even when they're online, though. So don't go crazy here. The next tip is to embrace presenter view. So your notes are like your underwear. They're for your personal use. They're not for the public to see. And some people, the way they use PowerPoint is they put their notes, every bullet that they plan to present, they put on screen for everyone to see. It's like, this is not appropriate. It's also really boring. So in that way, it's not like your underwear. And it doesn't make for good slides. So don't put a lot of text on the slide. Don't put everything you're going to say on the slide. If you're planning to do that, just don't use slides. Your face is more interesting than your notes. Now, both Keynote and PowerPoint have a presenter view where you can see something different on your screen than is shown on the projector or on the webinar. And if you're using presenter view, you can have all these wonderful notes with everything you want to say, while what everyone else sees is a very simple slide with maybe a single word or simple phrase on it. And if you do this, your slides will get way more interesting. And this is what I do. If you attend one of my webinars, you'll notice I don't put a lot of text on the screen at any one time. I let the photos do the communicating. Sometimes I'll just show a photo with no words at all. Other times there'll be 1 word or a few words. But if you were to see my presenter view, you'd see that I sometimes have whole paragraphs worth of notes of things that I plan to say while that slide is up. To use presenter view for a webinar, you will need 2 monitors, one to share and one to view. Most authors already have 2 monitors because it's one of the cheapest purchases that you can make to dramatically increase your productivity. Or perhaps you have a laptop and then you have a monitor that you plug into that laptop. just extend your display onto the monitor and use them as two different screens. You share one screen, you look at the other, you're good to go. Another tip on how to prepare is to get to know your audience ahead of time. And you can actually do this in a really cool way with webinars. So webinars, every good webinar platform has a poll function where you can survey your audience. And I try to add polls to every webinar. Why? Because I want to adapt my presentation to the audience. And the most important thing to know about an audience is how advanced they are on a topic. I don't want to tell people things they already know because they'll get bored and leave. But I also don't want to talk over their heads with terms they don't understand. And the only way to adapt my vocabulary to the audience is to understand how familiar they are with the topic, right? Can I use the phrase SEO? Do I need to say search engine optimization instead? Or should I go with the simplest, ranking high on Google, right? Depending on the sophistication of the audience, I have to know which phrase to use. And you can survey your audience, and this will really help you as you adapt and prepare your presentation. So now you've prepared your presentation, let's talk briefly about webinar platforms. Which one should you use? I've used a few webinar tools, and I'm going to give you the pros and cons of those tools and which ones I like and which ones I hate with the burning passion of 1,000 suns. So let's start with Zoom, vanilla Zoom. This is the classic mistake. The pros, though, of Zoom is that you know how to use Zoom, your audience knows how to use Zoom, and it's cheap. The cons is that it doesn't have good call to action support. It doesn't have a good registration flow or landing page. It doesn't feel special because of massive Zoom fatigue. People are really tired of Zoom. There's no email reminders to get people to show up, at least not a good mechanism for that from people registering. And there's no voting on questions. There's no good way for people to ask questions and vote on questions that other people have asked. So bottom line with Zoom is it's adequate for short events up to about 25 people. And you can pay for it for longer events, but really it's just not a good way to grow your email list, which is why Zoom launched their webinars platform. This is the expensive option that no one uses. So the pros are that you know how to use Zoom, your audience knows how to use Zoom, and it's reliable. The cons are that it's expensive. It starts at, I think, $690, $700 a year. It doesn't have good call to action button support. It still doesn't feel special. People don't know that this is the $700 version of Zoom. It just feels like Zoom to them. So you still have the problem of Zoom fatigue. It still doesn't have the question voting. It does have a good registration page. It does have the email reminders, so that's something. But $690 is a lot to pay for that little amount. So the bottom line for Zoom webinars, there are better options for less money. And the next platform is Crowdcast. This is what I use. I've used, half a dozen different webinar platforms over the years. Some have gone out of business, and thank God for that. But I'm very happy with Crowdcast. So it has the best interaction controls for interacting with the audience. It has a public chat that you can turn on or off, but I always leave it on. It has polls, it has questions, and it's the only platform with this, voting on questions. So when I'm hosting an event with 500 people, I can't get to every question. And what often will happen is in this instance on other platforms is whoever sends in the question at the right time gets their question answered. And that question may not be the most interesting question for the most people. Whereas with Crowdcast, people can vote on the questions. And so the questions with the most votes get answered first, and only questions with a lot of votes get answered. And so it helps make the question and answer segment of my webinars really popular. In fact, when I do a patrons only episode, I use Crowdcast, and the whole thing is nothing but the questions and answers functionality using Crowdcast. Although I also use the next feature that Crowdcast has, which it's got a really good mechanism for bringing audience members on screen or on stage. So somebody can type in a question and I can answer it. But if they want, I can bring them up where everyone can see them and we can have a conversation. They can ask follow-up questions really well, and I really like that. It also scales really well. So a lot of platforms, if you have one popular event, they make you upgrade to some really expensive monthly program. which if you're not doing super popular events every month, you're like, I don't want to pay $250 a month every month just because I did that one popular webinar that one time. And so with Crowdcast, you can keep your smaller plan and just pay an overage. And it's very reasonable. The last overage I got was, I don't know, $20. And I was happy to pay it because it kept me from having to upgrade to a more expensive monthly plan. It's got great stage control. It's got Patreon integration. So you can have a patrons only webinar and it will check to see if somebody's a valid patron. You can do paid events if you want. I haven't tried that feature, but it's an option. I will say Zoom Webinars also supports paid events. Most webinar platforms support paid events, although vanilla Zoom doesn't. And another thing I really like about Crowdcast is that the event link, whatever URL I sent people to attend the webinar, turns into the replay link. So if somebody clicks the link after the webinar is concluded, it takes them straight to a page with a replay, which really makes sharing the replay simple. I found I still have to email everyone the replay link because they're used to other platforms that are harder and more complicated where you have to jump through a bunch of hoops to watch the replay, but at least it makes it easy for me. The one con of Crowdcast is that it's expensive, or at least it's expensive if you've never paid for webinar software. It's about $49 a month, which is pretty typical actually for webinar tools. So a true webinar tool, a true email list building tool is more expensive than, say, a podcasting tool. I do have an affiliate link for Crowdcast if you're curious to check it out. And the next platform is StreamYard. It's the best audio quality for podcasters. So it's more special than Zoom, but its core cool feature is that it does what's called a double-ended recording, which gives both you and the guest an in-studio sound. So as far as the recording or the replay is concerned, StreamYard actually has a higher quality replay than Crowdcast. And you may be like, well, you're a podcaster. Why don't you use StreamYard? It's like, well, it's not as good for the audience interaction. There's no questions interface. There's no questions voting. And it's more geared towards simultaneous live streaming on YouTube and Facebook than for truly hosting a webinar. But it's a really good platform. I think it's also the $49 a month. So it's really comparable to Crowdcast. And it's probably the best choice if recording quality is the most important thing to you, if you're planning to take that live event and turn it into a podcast. For me, when I record my podcast episodes, I do it either through Descript or Riverside. So I don't use Crowdcast to record podcasts because it's not quite there quality-wise. And I do have a link for StreamYard, and it might be an affiliate link by the time you go to the show notes. I'm not sure. I signed up for the affiliate programs of all of these platforms, actually. And some of them have gotten back to me. Some of them have not. But I recommend them regardless of whether I get an affiliate commission. Some webinars platforms I've heard good things about, but I haven't tested enough to make a full-on recommendation. One is Webinar Ninja. This is very expensive, but all the features are there, and I've heard good things about it from people who use it. They tend to really like it. The other is Webinar Jam. This used to be the budget option, but now it's about the same price as Crowdcast. So the webinar platforms are all kind of consolidating on the same pricing, kind of like how the email platforms all consolidated on the same pricing. But Webinar Jam is a decent platform from what I've heard. Okay, so here are the two webinar platforms that I hate with the passion of 1,000 suns that are still around. Meeting Burner can go and continue to burn as far as I'm concerned. So GoToWebinar, dated, buggy software, expensive. This was the best webinar platform in 2008, and I don't feel like they've made any improvements to it since then. And it's just no good. And the other one is WebEx. Again, dated, buggy software. I think they still require you to download a client. Everything else runs through the browser. So Webinar Jam, Webinar Ninja, StreamYard, Crowdcast, those all run through Chrome or Firefox. Zoom runs through an app, but it runs through an app everybody already has. And there's a world of difference between, I already have Zoom on my computer, and how do I download WebEx? What is WebEx? How do you spell it? What is GoToWebinar? Oh, it's awful. So hopefully that helps you get an idea of which webinar platform to get. In my next episode on the webinar series, which I'll do in a few weeks, I'll talk about engaging live with the audience and how to deliver an entertaining webinar and some lessons I've learned the hard way. I've been giving webinars for 13 years now. I think I did my first online live webinar in 2010. And let me say, all of these platforms, except for GoToWebinar and WebEx, are so much better than what we had back then. We didn't have Crowdcast back in 2010. And the audio quality, video quality, and just quality of everyone's internet connections has really gone up. So back in my day, the webinar platforms, they were terrible. If you want to see one of my webinars and watch how I do it, I'll have a link to my most recent webinar about book launches. This is a webinar that I did that promotes the Book Launch Blueprint, which is coming up April 14th. 2023 is the last day to register. If you're listening in the future, we do the Book Launch Blueprint once a year, typically in the spring. And so you can go to booklaunch.fun to either sign up to attend the 2023 Book Launch Blueprint or come to one of the future Book Launch Blueprints. And the reason why this course is so important is because your launch, those first 30 days, are critical to success. It's what determines whether or not the algorithm on Amazon is going to recommend you. It's what determines whether you stay on the bookshelves. It's really critical. And so you can't just release your book. You need to have a plan. You need to know what you're doing. And it really helps to not learn everything the hard way. So in the Book Launch Blueprint, we have pre-recorded training every day telling you what to do and lots of live coaching. So every afternoon, either me or James L. Rubart doing live coaching with you to help you put together the most amazing book launch that you've ever had. And you can find out more at booklaunch.fun. Our featured patron is Jennifer Lamont Leo, author of The Rose Keeper. During the Great Depression, a spoiled socialite must suddenly find a way to support herself and her child. Can she turn a homemade recipe for skin tonic into a livelihood? Find out by reading The Rose Keeper by Jennifer Lamont Leo. And I just want to thank you, Jennifer, for being a patron, helping support this podcast. You and all the other patrons get access to the patrons-only episode, which I host on Crowdcast, answering your question. A quick personal update. Jack, our baby, is now walking. He toddles around the house saying go, go, which is his favorite thing to do. He is a baby on the go. If people are leaving the house, he wants to go too. He just goes go, 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 go. He's ready to go. And he wants to do whatever his big brother and sister are doing, especially if whatever they're doing is something he's not big enough to do as well. So he's a very busy toddler. The Novel Marketing Podcast is a production of authormedia.com. The audio engineering is by William Umstadt. The blog post version is crafted by Shauna Lettler, which has links to everything we talked about today. And you can find that blog version of this episode at authormedia.com/363. Or just do a search for a webinar. You'll find this and the other episodes we have about webinars. I'm Thomas Umstadt Jr. saying thank you for listening and live long and prosper.